Welcome to yet another webinar where I've been able to get another team member, James Rice, here to join me because we're talking lease renewals, not only as a revenue strategy, but ultimately it's something that you need to proactively approach because retention is a big key in this conversation, definitely big to our vocabulary of late. And at the same time, you also want to make sure you take a strategic approach to how you tackle it, right? And those conversations that you have. And these are things that we do regularly for our clients and then be able to expand upon as to why it's done, the approach that we take to it. And James is here because he's been doing this for years, not only on the leasing side, but then of course making sure that when we have good tenants, we're having these conversations to make sure that there is an opportunity to retain them long term. And so we'll dig into a little bit about what that looks like. We'll leave a little section at the end for Q&A for anybody that has some specific questions we may be able to answer. It's not necessarily about rent control, but we're going to be talking about that a little bit as well. And for those who don't know, my name is Conrad Bennett. I've been a licensed property manager and working with many clients like those that are joining this webinar for, dare I say, decades. James and I have been working together for more than a decade ourselves, right?
12 years.
Yeah. And tell us, James, your role with us, not only with the
Yeah.
business development side, but like leasing and managing the leases.
Yeah, no, well, thank you so much for having me. So, obviously I'm in the business development, but I'm also running the leasing department for any new lease ups, but also overseeing the critical aspect of trying to retain tenants. So from when a lease renewal goes out, until it's finalized. And obviously, if you cannot retain the tenant, I can also handle the notice to vacate, pre-marketing, releasing the place. So yeah.
All right. Well, for many owners, this tends to be one of the biggest financial decisions they make each year.
Yeah.
So it's critical that you tackle it with with an approach, with a plan, and we'll expand upon those timelines so that you feel as if it's prepared and not reactive, right?
Yep.
All right. So it's this time of the year. I mean, overwhelmingly, spring tends to be the kickoff to our rental season. And so, because of that, and if you're doing 12-month leases or sticking on this lease cycle, which we tend to find to be most productive anyhow, inevitably the conversation about renewals is going to be coming up this time of the year,
Oh
right?
yeah.
We've been seeing that the market has shifted. I wouldn't say falling off, but we've moved from that more aggressive growth to something more sustainable and stabilized. And so tell us what we're seeing in the market right now.
Yeah. Generally, right now, there's a lot of inventory out there. There is not as much demand as what you would normally see this time of the year, although this week things have started to pick up, which is nice to see. But overall, it's been a very slow start to the spring cycle. You know, there's a lot of factors involved, especially in DC, where it can, turn into more of a tenant-friendly market, and there being a lot of inventory. So right now, there's a lot of conversations I'm having with owners to try to retain tenants. The tenants that are leaving in within EJS portfolio, I see them moving out of the area, which I find interesting. Used to be, moving from neighborhood to neighborhood. So these are things where I'm having conversations with owners and doing everything that we can to try to retain them, because it's certainly harder to rent places right now than it normally is this time of year.
Yeah, I've definitely seen that tenants are taking their time, right?
Oh yeah. Oh yeah.
There's some they're comparing options. And then of course, when you have options, that certainly has an impact on the capacity to keep them moving. But
Yeah.
and of course, today's growth looks a little different than normal. But so do these conversations about these extensions and the renewals, because on the flip side of the coin, we've been seeing that tenants are staying longer. I mean,
Sure.
obviously, no two properties are created equal per se, but overwhelmingly it had been 3 to 5 years, and now I'm seeing like more like 5 to 7.
7. Right.
And so the conversations compound, and what you do the first year kind of sets precedence for the second, third, fourth, and fifth. And so you kind of need to consider that long-term game plan, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And, looking at our internal numbers, you know, the vacancy that we have, it's not a lot of our existing portfolio. I think right now we have an 80% renewal rate
Mhm.
within EJF. So a lot of the tenants that we have are staying, which is good, which you want, because once tenants move out, as we'll get to, not a lot of fun things can happen. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and we're going to talk about that a good amount on the next slide. But with owners with smaller portfolios, it's an all or none, right? It's
right.
100% or nothing. And so this is where vacancy truly does hurt our small housing providers. They don't have that buffer to be able to absorb the loss. So like if you had a 50-unit building, there's a numbers game there. When it's just the one, like I said, it's a pass fail. It's an all or none. And so these renewals ultimately are going to work towards increasing that return on that investment. But at the same time, let's just keep it simple. You want
Right.
to keep good tenants that pay the rent and take care of the place, right?
Absolutely. Keep
Yeah.
it simple. Yep.
So if we just go back to that basic, which we'll expand upon in a little bit, it's critical. So let's talk about what it looks like when tenants do move on. Inevitably, it may happen. And some owners, they could be a little aggressive on the rent increase, but if those tenants leave, that's lost income that's not going to be recaptured. So break down what the turnover is looking like these days.
Yeah. So, for using licensed and insured contractors, I mean, the price of turnovers has certainly increased over the course of the last few years. Obviously, it depends on how long the tenant was in the property, right? If we're talking 12 months, one bedroom, it's going to be less money. But if you get a tenant that's been there 4, 5, 6, 7 years, depending on the size of the home, you're looking at least a month of rent being paid towards the turnover. Now, maybe some of that security deposit from the tenant can be used, but for the most part, you're going to be shelling out potentially $1,000, $2,000 to get units ready for marketing again.
Yeah, and inevitably there's going to be the vacancy period that has been on the uptick. There's going to be the leasing fees, and if it's not with a company like us that will have a fee for the time, it's going to be you that would be
Sure.
working, going back and forth, and I mean, as much as I would love for one showing, one application, that's not the dynamic we're seeing right now.
No, I miss those days. Can we get those back,
Yeah,
please?
and DC's resilient, it will, but
Yeah.
right now we have to work with what we got,
Right.
and so you have to consider the time and energy that's going to be involved in it. And it doesn't matter if you're around the corner on the other side of the world, being able to help answer those questions, have that traffic is critical. Being able to facilitate the repairs and have a contractor that you trust is essential. And then, of course, pricing it right. It's a conversation that we constantly have on the leasing side. So that's where we want to dig in here on the rental side, because when you do overly impose an increase because you really don't know the numbers, or you saw something, or you might have had a different number in mind a few years ago, or even if you're just considering your cost basis between your mortgage and insurance and taxes and association fees, sometimes the numbers just don't math, right? And so
Correct.
got to make sure that we're accommodating the numbers that will work in whatever the dynamic the market is dictating at the time. So that's where our expertise comes when the ebbs and flows. So we know that if the tenant leaves, it's going to be problematic, and that's why we're proactive in these conversations. So I'll
Hmm.
give you the full rundown on everything here, because you know how best to approach these conversations and what the lead time looks like.
Yeah, absolutely. So, and obviously it depends on where the property is located, right? But where I want to focus on primarily is DC. So, um,
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead.
Oh, my bad. So Depending on the requirement that you're imposing in the lease agreement for a tenant to provide a notice to vacate will really determine when the renewal timeline will start. So, um, generally speaking, we require 60 days notice for a tenant to provide us on a 12-month lease. So you want to start at least 60 days before that in advance, in my opinion, because you don't want to get down to the wire where you're scrambling to get something renewed and then missing the date. And then you have to push back everything, a month, because DC is very strict when it comes to that. So we start engaging the owners and our tenants 120 days out from the end of their lease term, trying to gauge what the tenant is thinking in terms of renewing, in terms of I'm going to be going elsewhere or I'm going to be purchasing a property, but also feeling out what the owner wants to do, letting them know what the market is like, letting them know, if it's good, bad. There's a comp that we can get a certain amount of money on. So we want to start having those conversations because not usually, one conversation with the owner, one conversation with the tenant, you got a done deal. There's a lot of back and forth involved. So starting in advance is critical because you want to make sure that you're meeting your timelines, you're meeting that to ensure that that you're getting this renewed as quickly as possible. That's the end goal here is to keep that tenant. So once you have a game plan in place with the owner, you can engage the tenant, make sure you're providing them the options of at least a month to month to rent. That's a requirement in DC, obviously, but we also like to, provide at least a 12-month lease option. Generally speaking, you want to incentivize them to stay. So you would generally want to do a 12-month lease at a lower rate and then a month to month at a slightly higher rate, just because there's a little bit more risk that's involved with the month to month. But there's no way around that with DC, unfortunately. So really, time is critical, and you want to start in advance to ensure that you're trying to wrap this up as quickly as possible. That's the key.
Yep. Yeah. So one key takeaway, start early. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
rings true to everything that we're doing these days. We've done previous presentations on licensing, which is a lengthy process. We've talked about prepping the properties for marketing, which is sadly, you just can't snap your fingers and have it done immediately. So there's a process to it. And that's why we go through this methodically, planning and prepping and making sure that you do a thorough evaluation to, at least from our perspective, so that we're giving good guidance on what to anticipate, what to expect, and then of course build in those timelines and work backwards. Because if we are having a back and forth between you or the tenants, we still want to make sure that we give adequate notice, because all of that, those discussions would be a moot point if we miss our deadlines, right?
Correct.
And so it's critical to be able to put that forward and work backwards, right?
Yeah,
So
the only other thing I would say is, sorry, Conrad. The only other thing I would say is tenants nowadays have a lot of information at their disposal. They know they know their rights better than they did 10 years ago. Let's just put it that way. So you got to make sure that you hit those benchmarks and those deadlines are met. That's all.
all right. So when we're looking at evaluating a tenant, I mean, this framework might work with, I mean, obviously it works well with us in terms of how we position our owners for the long-term success. But no matter what we suggest, we don't know what the tenant's ultimately going to decide, right? And
Yeah.
so this is why we want to make sure that we have the front end stuff. This is why we have specific people that are digging into this, so that when we have these conversations, we have all the facts. Because quite simply, I'd have to go back to the basics, which is it's easier to make a decision when you know more of the variables, right? And
Right.
so break down how these different subsections to our review, so that owners know when we're reaching out, we our like what has supported our decision of being in the position where we really want to keep the tenant, right? I mean, but
Hmm.
I mean, I would say that if they're paying the rent and taking care of the place, that's certainly a good factor. if we're neutral or if it may be worth a conversation about being more aggressive on the lease renewal.
Yeah. So, there's a lot of different scenarios. There's not a one size fit all. The number one thing that I look at and, I instruct my team on is, do they pay on time? Are they paying rent on the first of every single month? I think that is by far the biggest piece of this. Now, secondary is maintenance, how clean the property, how they take care of the property, and if they are a pain in the butt. It's really the or not when it comes to the secondary factors. Now, on the flip side of things, if they're not paying the rent on time and they're constantly late, that's a more sensitive conversation that you want to have with the owner about potentially, maybe upping it a little bit more and maybe just offering a month to month, to try to get them out sooner rather than later. So, really it comes down to on time payments is by far the most critical. And if they check every single box, which a majority of our tenants do for the most part, and the market being what it is, you're going to want to be a little bit more conservative on that price increase than you normally would. The more problematic tenants, you may want to be a little bit more aggressive on. That's really what it comes down to from a big perspective, if that makes sense.
Yep. Yeah. So we're looking at the full picture, not just the
Yep.
rent.
Yep.
And one thing that I also like to consider, and I know you alluded to it, is that sometimes the tenants look fine, but properties could be expensive operationally. And so
Right.
being mindful of what would go into getting it back online. Many owners should have a hard time forgetting how much it costs to get it prepped for that condition, uh,
Yeah.
and and be prepared for what that would look like if the tenants do vacate. And that should be a decision in the back of the head as we're going through and navigating these conversations,
Right.
right?
Absolutely. And that's why it's critical. I mean, I know we're not talking about maintenance or inspections, but that's why it's always good to have a good property management company to go in there and do a compliance safety inspection of your property to see what the condition of the place looks like. And that,
Yep.
comes down to time and energy. So,
Right. Because we've had, or I've at least talked to plenty of owners that have inspected it before the tenant moved in 10 years ago.
and
We,
they haven't stopped by since.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So you don't know what you're getting into, and having that regular inspection cadence does help paint that picture of how well they're taking care of it, and it's critical. And I know we'd mention it under the property condition, but if you don't know, you shouldn't assume the best, unfortunately. I think it's better to prepare for the worst and hope for the best, right?
Yep.
All right.
Absolutely.
So as a quick pause, next month's webinar is going to be about navigating rentals within condos. I'm going to have an association manager join us under the EJF umbrella that has extensive experience in both managing rentals and condos. And we're going to talk about the symmetry between the two. So this QR code gives you an opportunity to sign up right now. But at the same time, we're going to be sending out additional invitations over the upcoming weeks so that you can be mindful of what it looks like if you are currently or anticipating leasing out one of your properties, if it's in a condo association, HOA, or a co-op. Again, it's all about the proper planning so that you have everything in place to make that decision when those times do in fact come. So since we started talking about the tenant evaluation, let's just talk about what it looks like if you were on that fence, if we're going to renew or if you end up releasing the property. So conservative renewals obviously will give you the most likelihood that the tenants are going to renew. And of course, there's no guarantees with any of this. But the more aggressive you can become, the more of that becomes a variable. And then if they leave, we're back to square one, right?
Right.
And so to optimize net income, is this the framework that you're looking at? Just those basics?
Yeah. This is a conversation I have with owners all the time because, a lot of owners think, well, I'm getting 2,500 right now and we can bump it up to 2,600, that probably means at market rate we can get 26 or 27, right? And I'm like, no, it's actually going to be less than what you're getting right now, because of X, Y, and Z. So I really think about these two prices, a renewal price versus a release price, as two separate things. And it's a conversation that, you have to explain, to the owner about. And really the increase that you're giving to a tenant is more out of a convenience because the tenant's already there, right? They're already expecting some sort of increase. And, if we are conservative about it and you want to keep the tenant in there, there's a higher likelihood that you're going to get that higher rent with them staying, which will cut down on no vacancy, no leasing fee, no turnovers, nothing that we talked about previously.
Yeah.
So it's kind of a double whammy, especially in this market right now. If you have to release the place, you're probably going to get less than what you're going to get right now. Again, this is kind of a generalization. Every property is different. And you're going to be paying for a turnover, leasing, et cetera, et cetera. So that's something that you just need to explain, to landlords sometimes, and hopefully they understand.
Right. And that'll be a good transition because when we're talking about structuring that dual option
Yeah.
approach, increase, no increase, it doesn't have to be so cut and dry. It could be a little more dynamic because of the renewal options, being able to get the commitment for an annual extension versus maybe a little more when they're looking for that flexibility on the month-to-month side. But in our experience, you got to set a precedence. And so as tenants are moving in year one, anticipate imposing some form of an increase year two, and so on and so forth. Because if you have a tenant that's been living there for 10 years that has never had an increase, there's definitely a room for an improvement, rental wise, but at the same time, how aggressive is that going to be, and how much of a shock is that going to be to the tenant, right? Um,
Right. And there's a potential they could dispute that if it's significantly higher, you know. So that's why it's important to try to do some sort of increase every 12 months in
yeah.
DC. Yeah.
And to that point, it is only one increase every 12
Per year.
months, in DC, and we'll talk about the other jurisdictions. But this has been a very useful option for our owners to always give that ability to extend on an annual basis. It gives certainty, it gives capacity. It's something that you can start to plan around. But month to month isn't all that bad. Heck, we've had tenants on month to month leases for years, maybe decades, right?
Right.
But owners may want the flexibility, tenants may want that flexibility. And so all we want to do is present the options, discuss what it would look like, because don't forget, you got to turn around and see what the tenants are feeling like, right?
Right.
And then, but source them out and make note of that so that if they're making a decision because of one thing or another, whether or not it's uncertainty in their job or a relationship or neighborhood, or maybe they're looking for something bigger or they're looking to buy. I mean, these are all factors that are relevant and need to be discussed as they come into play, right?
Right.
So it's
Absolutely.
critical to make those notes as we have those extended conversations. Anything else here that you wanted to break down?
No, I think I already touched on the month to month always being a higher rate, more premium, and I try to push people for a 12-month extension if
Yeah.
possible.
All right. Well, give us a pretty easy differentiator between DC, which I will say is probably going to be the most oversight. Maryland,
Yep.
kind of like that in between, and then Virginia, probably the easier to navigate across the boards. But
For
break this
now.
down for us.
Yeah. So DC, it has certain requirements that are involved with lease renewals, which I touched on, and I have seen a question in the Q&A, which I'm sure we'll get to towards the end of this. But they have certain periods where you have to get lease renewals to tenants. You have to provide a month-to-month extension option at the end of every single lease term. If the owner wants to sell the property at the end of the lease, it's not like you can ask the tenant to leave. You have to allow them to stay there while you're trying to sell the place. So there's certain protections that the tenant has in DC, and I would consider it the most tenant friendly jurisdiction out of the three. For Maryland, it there is a little bit more flexibility, but especially in Montgomery County, for a lease renewal, you have to provide them a 2-year lease renewal, a 12-month lease renewal, and a month-to-month option for the most part. There are certain exceptions to that, but there are things where you have to provide them multiple options, way more than DC. Their notice requirements are a little bit more flexible than DC is, but those are certain things that are involved. The good news is, there is no automatic right to an indefinite month to month, as Conrad has points out in this slide. So that's a positive. For Virginia, and this could change with new leadership involved. I don't know, but essentially, you can ask the tenant to leave at the end of any lease term, which is nice. And generally speaking, there's shorter notice periods that are involved in Virginia, and there's fewer automatic tenant protections. So, we could spend hours going through all the differences, but that's kind of a generalization of the legal frameworks.
Yeah. All right. Well, this is where that strategy meets reality, right? And so timing matters a lot. We've already stressed this plenty. You don't want to miss your window because you miss your flexibility, you lose your flexibility. And then when you're making decisions under pressure, it's rushed, it's hurried, and it may not necessarily be as planned as what we've expanded upon in the previous slides, right? So this is the part that we want to stress. Make a methodical decision so that you are comfortable with the direction it goes, and of course give a couple of options. But in the end of the day, tenants get to dictate what their next stage is going to be. Right.
Correct.
All right. Now, I say all of that because this is new and developing and an ongoing conversation that I'm having on the back end. But DC had a ballot initiative that may or may not be a factor later in these upcoming months. But there are proposals for rent freezes, including a mandatory 2-year rent freeze if DC voters approve it. So this would potentially allow for future rent restrictions tied to inflation. It would be applied broadly across rental housing, but it is going to or could have an impact on our owners. And so I think it's safe to say that we are opposed to it. We're looking for opportunities and fighting hard to make sure that this does not make it to the voters in these upcoming months. But once approved with the ballot initiative, one thing is that we wouldn't be able to revise it. It's a simple yes or no, and it's a public vote. So I want to make sure everybody's aware of this. And not only that, but as we go through this, we are looking for potential plaintiffs that would be up for supporting and bringing claim. So if you are interested in getting involved and you are a DC resident and you have a story to be told, it is important that you reach out to me as we're beginning to accumulate some names in case this is the avenue that we have to go. Many associations, including one that I'm heavily involved in, are against and opposed to this ever making it to the ballots or to a vote. So anybody that's on here, please do reach out. Let me know. I'm accumulating those names, but in theory, there is a significant impact and it compounds, right? And so if there's a high inflation year where the CPI has increased, it may lock in those rents. It's something that we'd heard and talked about back at the early days of the pandemic. And from our position, it does not allow for financial flexibility, and it could have a significant impact of several $1,000s lost for our clients that would compound each year, right? At the same time, we certainly do recognize that owners have rising property taxes, insurance on the increase, maintenance and repairs we've already talked about continue to be a big factor in that budgeting perspective. But we don't want to lose cash flow, those reserves, or increase the deferred maintenance because you have those other obligations that you may have when you have a certain lock in terms of the rent that you're receiving. All of which are factors in our determining decision on how we approach the lease renewal with those tenants, right? So along those lines, hey, here's the numbers that tell the story. I mean, you've seen this from both sides. We've seen owners that are aggressive. We've seen owners that are conservative. And I think that the moderate results and well-timed renewals outperform the aggressive scenario 9 out of 10 times, if not more. But you tell me, is this
Yeah,
usually how things play out? The more aggressive you get, the more likely there's a chance the tenants are going to vacate?
absolutely. I think if you are looking at increasing the rent, 10% above market or, even higher than that, there's a high likelihood, especially in this market right now, they're going to leave. They're going to find something cheaper. I mean, whoever's on this call right now, I just recommend going on Zillow and just seeing all of the dots of availability one bedrooms on the market in DC. It is astounding. The vacancy duration, 45 days. I mean, that's generally what the off season is. I mean, I'm seeing that right now, and it's supposed to be the on season. So it's very critical, especially in this market right now in this city, that you are trying to keep residents as long as possible, because there will be some vacancy involved, and most likely, you're going to be getting less in monthly rental income than you were previously.
And without being all doom and gloom, I mean, it's
Yeah,
just something that you want to be mindful of
just
because
be mindful.
the
Yep.
grass is not always greener, right?
Right.
And having the tenant that you know and have that longevity with, and reasonable expectations in terms of how they're keeping the property and that they're paying the rents, meeting those obligations. A new resident could take longer. We don't necessarily know that we're going to get the same or better, or worse for that matter, though we do everything we can and have had previous webinars about what it looks like and what we go through when determining and qualifying. But the more aggressive you are, the more of a risk it will become, and then of course it shifts the dynamic, right? We have a very significant and something that we're proud to report on, payment rate. 99% of our tenants are paying on time, and our renewal rates are pretty sizable, right? Well over 80%.
Yeah, well, I think the last time I checked, it was 82%.
Yep. And but it's a transient city, so inevitably some people will move on, they'll move out of the town, like James referenced earlier, or
Yeah.
find alternative housing. Maybe they do just outgrow the space that they started in. So there's a lot of factors, and we just have to be mindful of it all. So,
Right.
um, all right. Well, thank you, James, for joining me. So
Of
here are
course.
the key takeaways, and we'll jump into the Q&A. But lease renewals, they're a strategic decision, not just administrative tasks. Um, Early action, the sooner you get involved, it gives you the capacity to have some leverage and reduce the risk. And having that open dialogue goes a long way in terms of understanding what the tenants are thinking. And that way you can accommodate it appropriately. And that's a lot of the back and forth that we may have on our client's behalf, discussing what makes the most sense. And sometimes it may shift into not necessarily the month to month or the annual. We might find some other option that would really work to the equation. But the tenant quality certainly matters, right? You have to evaluate it as much as you would look at those rents and what else people are potentially getting, but that's theoretical. You want to, what they're asking isn't always what they get, right? I got to evaluate
Mhm.
both. And we got to take some risk adjusted decisions, um, because that way we're going to outperform the rest. And depending on which area you're working in, our approach is tailored appropriately. So with that, let's see. Do we have any questions? Happy to answer a few as we go through this. Looks like we got five. All right. I was told when the lease is up, the tenant pays on a month-to-month basis without renewal. Well, I would say that by default, the leases go month to month, right? And so as you go through the decision process, if you take no action, it continues indefinitely at the
Correct.
pre-existing terms. You do have the capacity to negotiate new terms,
Right.
right?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's
Um,
my understanding.
what are the deadlines?
So again, it depends. I assume this is talking about the note, the offering lease extension options. So if your lease agreement states you have to give a 60 days notice to vacate, you have to give them the options to renew 90 days in advance. If it's a 30-day requirement, or if the property is on a month to month, you need to give them a 60-day notice for a lease extension. So it's whatever the notice period is plus 30 days.
And buffer on the or error on the side of caution, I think is the easiest way to say it. More is better than less, right? Um,
Correct.
yeah. Leasing fees. I mean, ultimately, I think I'd reference we have a tiered leasing structure depending on the duration of the lease terms, generally starting the equivalent of the first month's rent. But the longer the lease, initial lease term, we do have an increased step up to 2 months worth of rent in some scenarios. Um, is there a specific month where you can increase rent notices? I mean, I would always look at what your lease allows, and strategically determine when it makes sense to broach the subject about a renewal. Again, just consider that you can only increase the rent once per calendar year. And I mean, we've always had some conversations that go back and forth between James and I in terms of when that is best, but I don't think anybody's going to argue that May, June, July are better to have these conversations than December, January, and February,
Yeah.
right?
100%. Yeah.
And so you'd have to look at what that could look like on the back end, because if the tenants do in fact give notice because of a rent increase, you got to be positioned to be able to get that place re-rented, right? Or
Mhm.
sold, or move back in,
Right.
or whatever else you plan on doing with it. Keep those as part of the conversation, right?
Yep.
There are different conversations about rent control that we did not really expand upon because they're
Yeah.
subject to rent control. Um, your rent increases are predetermined based on the CPI
Correct.
plus whatever, but I would still advise owners to take advantage of those rent increases, if not in their entirety, at least a portion, so that you are implementing those annual increases like we've mentioned previously, right?
Hmm.
All right. From Maryland, we should offering tenants a 2-year renewal option in addition to the standard renewal and month to month. If so, how does it align with the fact that there's no requirement for an automatic indefinite month to month tenancy?
It's a good question. I think it has to do with in Maryland, I believe you are able to end the lease agreement at the end of the lease term, I believe, in some jurisdictions, and that's why there's no indefinite month to month tenancy. But it that is just a requirement that the first question, that's just a requirement for the renewal options. So I think it's two separate things, in my opinion.
Okay. Um, well, the next one, I wish I had a crystal ball. What is your timing outlook on when the supply demand for rent will be balanced again? What do you think is driving the current imbalance? I,
Uh,
I mean,
I could, you want me to answer that or you got it?
well, this is the time of the year where we generally start to see things on the uptick, and we're not necessarily seeing it in its entirety just yet. But
Yeah.
James and I talk on a regular weekly basis, and even last week is different than this week, right?
Yeah.
And in the end, we are always looking at what we've seen in past years, and the seasonality of the markets tend to dictate that this time of the year is going to be the most productive. And so while we're waiting to see it, spring hasn't really sprung. We'll see what the next couple of weeks bring, but June, July, and August are usually pretty productive. In fact, I'd say everything from Memorial Day to Labor Day is a busier time of the year historically. But we've also seen markets slow down as early as Labor Day and typically as late as Thanksgiving, getting into the holidays and the seasonality. Last year was challenging when the government shut down August through half of November, rolled right into Thanksgiving. So, so that's the conversation for this year. Bigger picture, and I'm not a chief economist, but we ultimately look at the amount of construction that's going on in the city. We look at what the migration patterns are looking like from residents, and ultimately, overall, cities are still adding numbers. DC had reported that there are more residents living in the city, though I haven't felt it, I don't think.
Yeah.
We think that it's been going the opposite direction, but we need people to be coming and returning to the city to be filling up some of these doors. Will that be this year, next year? I mean, right now, based on early indicators, I'm not sure that it's going to be tremendously productive summer, but we
Two,
are always cautiously optimistic, right?
and I'll just say this. I mean, two other things that are impacting it is one being the shakeup in the federal government, less federal government jobs in the area certainly doesn't help with the, people, being able to live in DC. And the second thing is the condo sale market. I see a lot of people trying to sell their condos. They're not able to, and they're coming back on the rental market, which is creating this increased inventory. So there's just a lot of different factors in DC, which is driving this imbalance, between the supply and demand. So
Yeah,
that's
I'm
all.
glad you mentioned that. The accidental landlords have put a surge on that pressure,
Right.
which are clients that we work with. I mean, ultimately, and the relationship we have with a lot of real estate agents has helped give an outlet when you aren't finding the solution you initially went for. And of course, we can rentals allows it to kick the can down the road on the conversation about the sale, right?
Right.
Because quite frankly, most owners don't want to leave it vacant. It doesn't make sense. And so being able to find a good quality tenant for the next couple of years while things shift. And truth be told, DC has been resilient in that, and every potential downturn has typically had us shooting out of the cannon on both sales and rentals in due time. Um, all right, the next one I really I want to dig into. What if you have renewed the lease in the middle of that lease renewal, the owner wants to retake the property? I was going to mention this in an earlier, but you got to honor the terms of the lease, right?
Yeah.
And so don't overextend yourself. Don't paint yourself into a corner. This is why we want to have these conversations and figure out what makes sense. Now, if you approach the tenant and discuss what is happening and what you need to do, there is obviously that 90-day notice for personal use and occupancy. But if you committed through, 2028, you gotta anticipate that they intend to stay through that period and then continue the conversation from there. Is that a fair approach?
Yes.
Okay. I was told I can't see my tenant's lease. How do I get a copy? I mean,
That's
I don't, I don't know that story. But I think most leases are pretty standard. At least we use the standard Board of Realtors lease, so it's just a matter of reviewing. Um, Negotiate a renewal if it's part. The lease
we do
extensions
it.
are more work, so there is that additional fee, but it's
It's
based on.
nowhere close to a leasing fee. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah. And it really is the offset of the time and the energy and the back and forth.
Correct.
Everything that we just talked about does require our team's time. Um, and that way we're giving good guidance, but it is a flat fee. Um, what is your contact number?
Right here.
Yeah, just it's right here at the bottom. You can call me or you can email me. I'll be able to share that. And then which requirements in Maryland when you offer renewal? We
Um,
already covered that.
yeah,
Yeah. Awesome. Awesome. Well, then that looks like the last question. I do appreciate your time, James, and walking everybody through this. I hope our guests got as much out of it as we intended to cover. But if there's anything else that somebody wishes to address or take it something offline, I'm more than happy consult with anybody that's trying to work their way through their scenario, and maybe even talk about what it would look like for us to be able to take that extra heavy lift, concerns, frustrations off of their plate, and work it right into our systems, and manage that property going forward. So if you wish, definitely please reach out, and we'll connect in these upcoming days.
Thank you, guys. Thanks, Conrad.
Thanks,
Great day.
James.
Yep.
Thanks all.